We'll begin encouraging words in just a couple minutes. And while people are joining us, I'll thank Rick for joining us. You doing okay, Rick?
Doing pretty good. Doing pretty good.
Rick, you've traveled a lot.
Okay.
I don't think of myself as having traveled a lot until one day I had said something about that, and my mother-in-law said, "You've traveled a lot. You've been to three different continents and all kinds of yeah. Okay, it just doesn't quite. I don't think of myself quite that way. How about this, Rick? The most spiritual things aside for a minute, the most interesting place to visit, culturally kind of different experience, most interesting.
Hmm. Well, Africa is always pretty interesting, and of course, we lived in South Africa as a child, as a young person. Till I was about 13, I guess, 10 to about 8 years old to 13 or something like that. So that was kind of different. Of course, that was back in a different time. In South Africa, it wasn't a great place to live in some ways then, but um, so this, but I find African history and African culture pretty interesting. My father, of course, preaches still in South Africa. He lives there still. He's 88 years old and still preaching in South Africa. And he kind of got bitten with the Africa bug young because I mean he took us to the Central Africa, a country called Malawi, when I was just 2 years old, and he's always been in love with Africa. And Africa sort of does that to a lot of people. It just sort of gets into your system in some way, and you just kind of really love it. And it's a really interesting place.
I guess interesting can be defined in a whole bunch of different ways. Um, I can remember my dad, my grandfather, Ray Ferris, Robert Spear, all of them telling about trips to Africa, living in Africa, and um, and telling me I can't quite I can't quite get you to understand, to feel it, to understand it. Um, and I have to tell you that as much as I've been exposed to it in so many different ways, really throughout my whole life,
Yeah.
uh, my grandfather was living in Nigeria when I was born. And so we were getting those letters, those pictures, and all those kind of things. Um, so I still, when I went to Sierra Leone, West Africa for the first time, it was sensory overload because there's so many different cultural, environmental kind of things to experience. And I think that's one thing. But by the way, I celebrate. I like when I go to Europe that the roofs are different, the construction is different, the language is different. Kind of revel in those differences, not begrudging. Well, this isn't like America at all. I like those differences, and so experiencing Africa was, I think, a real treat for me. It's
I think it's kind of interesting when you, having lived in Eastern Europe, as well. Um, and of course, Eastern Europe is getting more modern than it was even 25 years ago when we were there. But it was just coming out of communism then. But it's interesting when I watch a movie or something on TV. Sometimes you see things that's supposed to be maybe set in Eastern Europe, and you see things and you realize, yeah, that's the way it is. So a guy will pick up his hand even in the movie, and his wedding ring will be on his right finger. Which, oh, what's he got his ring ready for? Well, that's the custom there. They wear their in
right.
Eastern Europe, they wear the wedding ring on the right hand, and so it's interesting when you are able to see, oh yeah, they got that right, or they didn't get that right, or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, it's fascinating.
You know.
And I'll say that when you travel, whether it's around this country or whether it's especially around the world, and it gives you a taste of so many different cultures and people, it opens your eyes not only to your blessings that you have in this country, but to the opportunities to preach the gospel that are really, really needed all throughout the world. We haven't begun our study yet. For those of you who are just joining us, and we'll try to rope in this little travel discussion that Rick and I were having, and I'll begin first by welcoming all of you. Thank you so much. We always appreciate so much that you coming. John, the 3rd John in verse 2 says, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and in health, just as your soul prospers." There are lots of great greetings in the New Testament. This one in 3rd John 2, I think, is especially meaningful in challenging times like these, because we truly do pray that you prosper in all things. So this is a great way to welcome you to our study, and we do hope, as this verse says, that you will prosper from it.
It's interesting that sometimes as we read New Testament letters, we have a tendency to just sort of blip over those prayers when we get right onto the message and of the book, and yet we don't realize that very often there are sometimes some pretty neat things that are said, some very inspiring and encouraging and deeply meaningful things that are said, and especially those greetings, which are very often very heartfelt greetings for brethren, and that's kind of like we feel about when we say hello tonight, on a program like tonight, because we really do feel deeply connected to our audience, to people who are listening and sharing this study with us, and we're very, very thankful that you join us for the study, because we do care about you, and we do share in some wonderful spiritual blessings together, and that makes us close, and it's helps tells you the way we feel about you.
And so today we want to kind of pause and take a quick look at this greeting in 3rd John verse 2, because we find what I think is an encouraging word in here too, and that's our word for today, is the encouraging word prosper.
Right. Unfortunately, what is a really good verse has kind of been hijacked by the health and wealth preachers in our religious world today, who sort of turned the word prosper in this verse and this whole verse really into kind of a dirty word, or a verse that we sort of kind of turns us off a little bit because of the spin that they put on this verse. Unfortunately, they jump on this verse and go everywhere preaching not the word of God, but preaching their own word, which is a message about the health and wealth gospel. They use this verse, for example, as kind of a proof text for the idea that we ought to expect God to bless us physically, financially, and materially in the same way that he blesses us in spiritual things. And so according to them, the richer you are as a Christian, the more obvious it is that God is blessing you spiritually. And that's the way they kind of use that and preach it that way.
It's sometimes common in some of the religious circles to think that material prosperity is a sign of God's favor, or even a measure of someone's faith. Or on the contrary, the lack of physical blessing is an indication that there's some kind of secret sin or lack of faith. It just takes just a quick look in the book of Job, especially if you look later on, chapter 8, chapter 22, with Job's friends who were throwing the same thing at Job. We know from the early part of Job that Job was a perfect man, and so all this bad stuff that was happening in his life was not an indication that there was something, spiritually deficit in his life, or that there was some kind of sin. And yet his friends just kept on him about, wait a minute, we know God blesses those who are faithful. You're not being blessed. Obviously, you're being arrogant, or you are some way or another hiding your sin. And that approach and that interpretation also then makes the hardships and the poverty and even the deaths of spiritual people throughout history something that is saying something about them, that there was something wrong with that, with the apostles, with the prophets, for those people who remain faithful all through through their service to God. In Hebrews chapter 11, we're familiar with some of the great stories of faith there, but not all those people prospered. In fact, at the end of the reading, it talks about how that women received their dead raised again to life. Okay, that's prospering, but others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute and afflicted and tormented. These people were not physically prospered. We would say they were spiritually prospered. And here's something that's interesting about it: of whom the world was not worthy. So we got to be careful with our understanding of prosperity and not judging things spiritually based on physical things that we have or don't have.
Yeah, I think it's just, this whole message gets things completely wrong, especially in passages like that. It almost says that these guys, seems to say that these guys weren't what they ought to be, and yet clearly the text is saying they were what they ought to be. They were people who weren't even worthy of the rest of us, as it were, kind of thing. And you think about the apostles themselves, and probably the one that is most obvious is Paul evidently didn't understand the health and welfare gospel, or wealth gospel, like he should have, because he sure wasn't blessed physically and materially. And so this whole health and wealth social gospel, it sadly not only perverts the true gospel, but it ultimately gives the naive a false sense of hope that marks them as kind of easy praise for the charlatan preachers who are going to come along and basically enrich themselves off of others. And so it's just literally an unfortunate thing, and it's unfortunate that this really good verse is used that way.
I'll add that sometimes physical suffering, even spiritual suffering, can make us vulnerable in this area, where we look at this verse and think, oh, I need this so bad in my physical life. And here this guy is offering that. And as Rick said, it makes us easy prey sometimes for misinterpretation of 3 John verse 2. And not only does it make us easy prey to lose maybe some things, but also sometimes it shakes people's confidence in God. You said you would prosper me and you didn't. And so they unfortunately abandoned God. But prosper is an encouraging word, not just a don't think of it that way. So Rick, get us started on the encouraging part.
Sure. Let's go back to that passage in 3 John verse 2 and talk a little bit about what is being said in that passage. It's not just about what it's not saying. But let's begin, first of all, by just kind of defining our encouraging word, which is the word prosper. It pretty much means what we all sort of think it means. It means to succeed or to flourish in something, often in terms of physical, material, or financial things. It's actually used in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 2 when we're being taught about the collection that's supposed to be taken for the saints on the first day of the week. The text talks about how each one is to give as he may prosper. There's our word. And of course, in that context, it's clearly talking about you give in keeping with your financial, material prosperity. And so it means it certainly does talk about, physical, material flourishing of sorts. But prosper can also be used metaphorically for flourishing in some other way, like in 2 John, especially in the second part of that verse, if not in even the first part of that verse, but where it describes prospering or flourishing spiritually. So it's a word that means to flourish or succeed, but it doesn't, and it certainly in a very literal sense, maybe to do that financially or materially, but it can also be used metaphorically to describe a spiritual flourishing.
There are some people who suggest that phrase, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be in good health, was a saying, a common greeting that people had either when they saw each other, when they greeted one another, when they say goodbye to one another, or that was also used in ancient letters, sort of like the grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, which appears in several different letters like Philippians chapter 1, verse 2. Some languages today have very similar greetings where they say, things like go with God, or we say God bless, or sometimes people just say blessings, and it may be kind of similar to that.
And of course, many times, though there starts out with this kind of a spiritual message with some of those blessings, many times in different cultures in ancient world, their spiritual meaning, and even in our world, is lost, so that these kinds of greetings become just kind of a sort of nice way of saying hello or goodbye, or hope everything's going okay with you, and that kind of thing. That sort of thing has happened with the grace and peace from God our Father, shalom from God our Father. That sometimes didn't have much meaning, much spiritual meaning to people in the first century world. And so it's kind of interesting that Paul seems to tag on to that grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. And he seems to sort of be trying to say, let's get back to that spiritual blessing that's connected in this greeting. It's not just a kind of a bless you when you sneeze kind of thing. It's a statement that really means something, about something spiritual, about God blessing us and that sort of thing. It's kind of a spiritual greeting.
I remember when we were in Slovakia, when there's a word that has several different meanings, but the primary meaning is unfortunately or sadly, and it's the word bohužiel. Bohužiel literally means God's sorrow, and it doesn't really have anything to do with God anymore. It's lost that God part, and it just means, well, unfortunately. But you can understand maybe its roots, that things that would make God cry are unfortunate events.
And David, you remember when we were renting our house, and the guy we were signing up with wanted us to drink an alcoholic drink, and we said we don't drink at all, and he said bohužiel.
That's right. God cries about that. So obviously it's lost its original connotation, and a lot of those did. And in the New Testament, sometimes you can feel authors trying to kind of pull them back into deeper meaning. Here you have grace and peace, but really from God and Christ. And I think that there's a sense in which that's happening here in 3 John and verse 2. John uses the word prosper, which has a prosperous journey kind of connotation. It's used that way in Romans chapter 1 and verse 10. So somebody said it can be reworded something like, I pray that you have a prosperous and healthy journey in life, like you are having a prosperous journey in your spiritual life. I like that way of kind of looking. It's not saying, here, pray to God and he'll just give you like a magic genie, anything that you want. This doesn't deny that God gives physical blessings either, but it doesn't promise anything either. It's saying, wouldn't it be great if your physical life was going as well as your spiritual life is going? Wait, would that be a great thing?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, it makes me think of folks who came to Jesus to be healed, and he would say to them, it shall be done to you according to your faith. For example, in Matthew chapter 9, when those two blind men came to Jesus, and Jesus said, do you believe that I can do this, that I'm able to do this? And they said, we believe, Lord. And he said, let it be according to your faith. And the question, I think, would we want to be blessed according to our faith, or in keeping with our faith? Or maybe we would want to be blessed. We would, knowing because our faith is weak or something like that, we would want to be blessed more than our faith, because we know that our faith isn't what it ought to be. In some ways, this kind of a statement that we're seeing in 3 John verse 2, here Gaius, John is sort of saying, Gaius, I wish, I pray that you would be physically blessed as much as you are spiritually blessed. Wow, that's a great way to think about things. And wouldn't we have a lot if that were the case?
And I think that is exactly what's happening here. It's not really a promise that we'll be blessed more physically if we get stronger spiritually, but it's helping us look at ourselves spiritually. There's nothing wrong with prospering physically, but the greatest emphasis is on the interests of the soul in this verse. We put first things first. There are really no second things. All the other things fit into the first things, into the spiritual things. And it's almost like he's saying, if you get the spiritual things right, wouldn't it be great if in your life the physical things were, matched that?
Right. We've already mentioned the name of Gaius because he's the guy to whom this statement is made. This letter is written. It's addressed to a guy named Gaius, and there are a couple other Gaiuses in the Bible. So we don't know if this is one of those Gaiuses or a different Gaius altogether. We really don't know enough about this particular Gaius to know if he's connected with one of those others that we read about. For example, in Acts chapter 19, when Paul is in Ephesus, Gaius and Aristarchus stand between Paul and the crowd there who are trying to threaten Paul. But so he may have been that same Gaius, or he may not. We just don't know. But there's some things that we can know about him in this letter, and it seems very evident from 3 John that John really felt close to Gaius, so close that he describes him as one of his children in verse 4, and no less than 4 times he uses the word beloved to describe Gaius. In verse 1, verse 2, verse 5, and verse 11, he calls him beloved. And of course, when we begin to learn what about this man's spiritual character, as it's revealed to us in this short letter, we begin to see why John would have thought of him as beloved. Gaius was a man, according to verse 3, who was walking in truth. Truth characterized this man's daily walk. I like that present tense, walking in truth. It's not he walked in truth, he was walking in truth. This was the way his life was characterized, as a man who was walking in truth. He was also said to be someone who was acting faithfully, and the New American Standard Version uses that expression, in whatever he did for his brothers, even if they were strangers, according to verse 5. Sometimes we know our brethren, sometimes we don't, and it didn't matter whether he knew them or not. He still was acting faithfully in the way he was serving them, and that was kind of an obvious evidence of his love and care for others. And added to this, it's not just that Gaius was this guy who was walking in truth and who was acting faithfully in behalf of other brethren. His love was manifested by that. This added to that is the fact that this guy was wearing this kind of behavior in his actions. It was evident it wasn't just something that he was keeping in himself. He wasn't walking in truth privately. He was walking in truth in front of everyone, so much so that we're told that others testified to John. That's the word that's used. They were testified to John and to the church about this man's walk in the truth and about this man's love for brethren. When you look at Gaius, you really kind of have and you wonder, what does it look like to be someone whose soul prospers? Gaius is a picture of what that looks like. He's that kind of a guy and that kind of character.
You've got this little postcard of a book in the Bible, 3 John, and you don't think you're going to get very much out of it, and yet you've got this guy, and you find out all this stuff about him. It's unfortunate that we can see what a soul prospering looks like, but because of some misuse, we're kind of reluctant to talk about even spiritual prosperity.
That's right. That's right. So anyway, I want you to notice, of course, that John, as he talks about Gaius and his situation, he rejoices in the spiritual things that he hears about Gaius. He's happy that his soul is prospering. Maybe Gaius, we don't really know his personal experience, what was going on with him. Maybe he was experiencing some health issues or financial difficulties, and that may have been why John said to him that he prayed that his physical well-being would match his spiritual well-being. We don't know for sure what that circumstance was in the life of Gaius, or if there was any circumstance like that at all. What we do know is that Gaius' soul prospered before his soul prospered before he prospered physically. We know that Gaius' soul prospered without physical prosperity. We know that the prosperity of Gaius' soul was in no way dependent upon his physical prosperity. His soul prospered because of who he was in regards to truth and the service of his Lord. And that's why he prospered spiritually.
So that means that prospering physically is not wrong, but it doesn't mean anything about whether you're pleasing to God or not. Not prospering physically doesn't mean anything about whether you are pleasing God or not. We shouldn't judge our own selves by that. We certainly shouldn't judge other people in their life situations, shouldn't judge them based on that. Physical prosperity isn't a measure of God's ability to bless and prosper us. In Philippians 4, verse 12, Paul knew how to be in need and he knew how to have plenty. Neither situation was a statement of spirituality or of God's ability. He learned contentment and he concluded, I can do all things anywhere, anytime, with anything. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about this, what I think is a really inspiring and encouraging word, that God will prosper us and that he will be with us and give us the strength.
And so maybe we'll just close by saying that our prayer for you also is that you all, those who are studying with us tonight, you all may prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers. And we hope that that is wonderful. We hope that your soul is prospering greatly. Thank you very much for listening to us and studying with us tonight. We appreciate it very, very much.
God bless.